Happy Monday, Pathlings. I'm Spinpixy, your host today, and this week on Planet Pathlings we're talking about magical allies. My topic is the Witch's Familiar. To start, I'm going to go ahead and provide 3 definitions, including my own. A familiar spirit or familiar animal is a animal-shaped spirit or minor demon believed to serve a witch or magician as a domestic servant, spy, and companion, in addition to helping bewitch enemies and divine information. In legend, a familiar or familiar spirit is a supernatural being that helps and supports a witch or magician. Traditionally, a familiar is an animal, but in some cases are said to be humanoid. Familiars often have special powers of their own. When witchcraft is portrayed as a type of communication or alliance with evil forces in order to gain magical powers, a familiar may be considered a type of demon. My definition of a witch's familiar is that of the bonding of 2 souls in a transcendental way. It is often psychic and magical in nature, and it can sometimes be uncanny, but at the root of it all, it is simply that, familiar. Now, familiars often are mistaken for that of the unconditional love between a pet and their owner. However, in this video, I'm going to be talking about some ways to distinguish between the 2. How do I know my pet is a familiar? In the description box, I'm going to put the links to all the websites I used for this video, as I tend to do. However, the first one that I'm going to list has the best article on distinguishing your pet from a familiar. We love our pets unconditionally, and it is very hard to think of our pets just as pets and not familiars when we're witches. We like to think that we have 15 different familiars because we have 15 different pets, but that is not always the case. There are certain criterias that at the very least need to be considered before considering your pet a familiar, such as do they like to spend time on your altar? Do they seem to look into your magical things deeply? Do they sit with you when you're doing your spells calmly, not enclosed, not because you put them in there with you, but because it is their choice? Do they look sometimes like they're doing magic on their own? And they seem to have a magical link, and when you are either holding them or you pet them, there is something that happens, at least in my experience, there's something that happens with certain chakras and certain energy vibrations that happen when I just pet my cat. It's not typical that you will have 15 different familiars or 10 different familiars or even 2 different familiars at the same time. And just because one pet is your familiar doesn't mean the other pet is your familiar. Definitely having an influence in your magic, definitely wanting to be around your magic is a great sign that you do have a familiar. Just because you're familiar, you have the familiar and the familiar's brother, or your cat and your cat's brother, and one is your familiar, doesn't mean that the other one is your familiar as well. It's just, there's a lot of different signs that are there. So I'm going to put the link to this article, which will have a lot of information in regard to that. So is a familiar the same as a spirit animal? If not, what is the difference? Well, I have found that a familiar will often come to you in the physical form, whereas your spirit animal or your spirit guides, they're going to come to you on the astral plane, and you can often seek them out, whereas a familiar will just happen into your life. That isn't to say that a familiar has to show up at your doorstep or anything like that. It's just that your familiar will happen. It'll be the right time. The planets will align, whatever you want to call it, and that pet that is to be your familiar will happen into your life. Spirit guides and spirit animals tend to exist mainly on the astral plane. So that's the biggest difference that I could give you. Where did the idea of the familiar come from? How did that start? Well, to give you a few variations of how the whole familiar thing got started is that to go back in history, Many people believed that since the beginning of time, that animals were associated with various deities known as power animals. Some examples of this can be Hecate and her hound, the Morrigan and the raven, Pan and the goat, and these are just to name a few examples. And the ancients believed that animals were closer to nature than humans and would often perform rituals and make offerings to their spirit animals in attempts to communicate with them and be closer to nature. Shamans believed that all things and beings, particularly animals, were in possession, of a spirit or soul. And one could attract the parts of these animals, their spirit or their soul, and their powers by mimicry. So what they would do is that they would dress in the appropriate animal furs and feathers and horns and in fleece-lined masks, anything that had to do with that animal they wanted to pull the energy from, and they would perform dances and ceremonies imitating the animal that they were trying to pull from. Then the shamans would keep use of the same animal spirit until the death of the shaman, at which time the power would dissipate or would be passed down to their apprentices. As far as a witch's familiar goes, the first historic note of a witch's familiar, or imp as it's referred to in the article, came during the European witch trials of the 17th century. References to a witch's imp are most prominent in the works of the English witch hunter Matthew Hopkins. Attributed with the responsibility of the intense increase of witch persecution in England between 1644 and 1646, Hopkins believed that witches made a pact with the devil or demon for her power. In exchange, she was given the gift of an animal called an imp or familiar to spy on others, carry out her wishes, or guard her. Animals believed to be imps or familiars were usually cats and dogs, but could also be other animals such as mice and toads. To feed this imp, the witch was given a third nipple or teat, from which the familiar would draw blood as its food. The teat could be located anywhere on the body of the witch, and was unusually shaped, sized, colored, though it was the most common, quote, identifier, unquote, of a witch. Do familiars exist in today's modern magical society? Many modern witches still use animals when working with magic, utilizing their primordial instincts and psychic ability to attune with nature and deities. Animals are considered sensitive to psychic powers and vibrations, and are welcomed into the magic circle when power is being raised, spells are being cast, or to aid with scrying and divination, as well as spirit communication. When working with the magic, animals can act as a guard in psychic defense, for they react visibly to negative forces and harmful energies. So that's pretty much it. I definitely would recommend checking out some of the websites in the description, especially the first one that I'm going to put. So I hope for those of you who have yet to find your familiar, that if you want one, because some witches don't, if you want your familiar, I hope that in time it will come to you. And for those of you who have had familiars, I know that you know what a wonderful thing it is. And if you don't have a familiar, if you never find that familiar that clicks with you or that you think is a familiar, that's okay too. It's not a necessity to practice magic. It's not something that has to happen. It's just one of those special things that does sometimes. So until next time, guys, I will see you later. Have a wonderful week. Many blessings, and thank you for watching. Bye-bye.